Alrighty. Welcome back to the Synaxis podcast. I'm Jordan.
And I'm Josh.
And our guest today is the author of School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. He's a literary scholar, an adjunct professor, a martial arts instructor, contributor to a variety of internet publications such as Op-Ed News, Intrepid Report, Unlimited Hangout, and many others. We welcome to the show, John Klyczek. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I'm really glad our friend Seraphim got us in touch with you. And this book is something else. It was quite a read. So I'm looking forward to diving into it with you. I guess just for our listeners, maybe you could give us a quick rundown on what the book is about. I know it's a lot, but
yeah. So the book can be broken down into two broader sections. So the first has to do with the privatization of education, and then the second has to do with the way in which education technologies are integrated into this privatization scheme. You could also add, I guess, a third dimension to it, which has to do with the role of the Order of Skull and Bones in facilitating both the privatization and the ed tech apparatus. So the privatization portion basically looks at the rise of what's known as the school choice movement. So this includes charter schools, voucher programs, education savings accounts, tax credits for tuition. So these are all basically different forms of either public-private partnerships or various schemes for funneling public tax dollars into private institutions, whether they be corporate charter schools or just private schools. And then the ed tech portion basically goes through a series of evolving technologies, starting with screen-based technologies, moving to wearable technologies, and then eventually implantable technologies. And I look at the ways in which the first two types of technologies data mine students to develop both artificial intelligence algorithms, but also social credit databases that would ultimately be managed through the merger of the student with the AI through the implantable brain-computer interfaces. And then again, the Order of Skull and Bones happens to have its hands in pretty much every phase in this evolving scheme.
How did you get into this kind of research?
So, well, the first article I wrote, and I never really intended to write about education because I teach, so I didn't want to necessarily poo-poo in my where I sleep, so to speak. And but during the governorship of Bruce Rauner in Illinois, so I'm in Illinois, he went through a phase where he was stalling on the budget, and I saw this as a ploy to push public institutions into private receivership, including public schools into the school choice model. And I knew that he was a big charter school proponent. There's actually a Rauner College Prep. If you looked at his State of the State addresses, he would promote a lot of the buzzwords that I heard Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt talk about. So these included the school choice, the cradle to career, workforce training, public-private partnerships, etc.
From cradle to career, our children's education needs to be our top priority.
And I was also working for an online tutoring company at the time. So I was seeing the ways in which the ed tech was sort of being promoted at the same time as this privatization scheme was kind of taking hold. And so I wrote an article called The Corporatization of Education, and largely just focused on Rauner using the budget crisis to push the school choice agenda. And Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt, who wrote the foreword to my book, she also wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. She worked for the Department of Education under Ronald Reagan and blew the whistle on a major technology initiative in 1981 called Project BEST, Basic Education Skills Through Technology. So somehow she got a hold of my article, sent me an email. And at first I thought it was like, oh, this has got to be like a virus or something. Can't be her. but it, it says, well, I gotta open it, even if it is like, I'll put it on a computer I don't need anymore, and I gotta see. But it was her, and she encouraged me to just keep writing. So that article basically became the first chapter of my book, and I just sort of continued to go from there. As far as the education technology part goes, I had been tutoring for this company that gave us an email that said that they were going to have IBM's Watson Copilot with us. So IBM's Watson is an AI system that can do all sorts of predictive analytics for basically any industry. So it can do like finance, it can do security threat assessments, it can diagnose stuff in terms of healthcare industry, and it can do ed tech stuff. It can do adaptive learning algorithms and other intelligent tutoring programs as well. And so I basically saw that every day I went to work, I was kind of being data mined by this thing that was basically going to eventually, right, replace me if it were ever to become sophisticated enough. So both of those things were happening. And I wrote that piece, and then Charlotte kind of got behind me on this project, and she put me in touch with my publisher, Chris Milligan, out of Trine Day Books. And then we sort of just took off from there.
And Charlotte Iserbyt, I think you mentioned she worked in the Reagan administration, Department of Education, and did you mention Project Best?
Yeah, just briefly, yeah.
Yeah, the better education skills through technology. And she was sort of whistleblowing on that, right, in her book.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah. So for those that don't know, so Charlotte she actually worked in the State Department first, right? So she worked in Middle Eastern affairs and Soviet affairs. And then when she came back, she ran for school board, and then founded something called Guardians of Education for Maine. And these experiences helped get her a position in the Department of Education under Reagan. And she worked for she was directly underneath Assistant Secretary Donald Sinise. And there was several other divisions within her Office of Educational Research and Improvement, OERI. So they put her on in several different divisions throughout the short stint when she was there. So one of them was school choice or public-private partnerships. And she was also in the technology division. And she said one day, I forget the woman's name, but one of her coworkers was at her desk, and Charlotte walked by, and she saw Project Best, and she says, "Ooh, what's that?" And she says, "Oh, I don't really want to mess with it. I'm busy. I've got other projects. Do you want to handle it?" And she was like, "Oh yeah," and she saw it, and some of the things in there that disturbed her, where there's a section in there that says explicitly what we can control and manipulate at the local level, right? Like how we can facilitate our federal initiatives at the local level. But basically what the whole entire project was it was a program to establish public-private partnerships between the Department of Education, various school districts, and technology corporations that would implement computerized learning, that would use operant conditioning algorithms to condition students for workforce training. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially, right, it basically laid the groundwork for everything in the book. And I've also, there's a piece I wrote at Unlimited Hangout on Project Best and UNESCO Study 11 that adds some further context to it that's not in the book. And this was after I met with Charlotte. So I knew Charlotte for probably since 2016 until she passed away in 2021. So I guess that's 5 years. But I never met her in person until 2020. And that would have been, first it was September. Some people wanted to film us for a documentary that never came out. Mm-hmm. But while I was there, for those who don't know, she had a brain bleed. Right. So I published my book end of 2019, October. And then between then and February of 2020, right? Remember, this is like, what is this, 5-6 months before COVID? So, right. All of that, sort of pushed everybody into the online stuff. So, everything I wrote about kind of came, front and center. I thought I had some time, but, she was not feeling well and needed someone to stick around the house. So I stayed there for a month. Okay. I lived with her for a month and she gave me a bunch of these files. I've got about 4 or 5 lobster crates filled with manila envelopes filled with all these files that she took out of the Department of Ed. And some of that stuff had to do with the UNESCO connections to Project Best and something called UNESCO Study 11. It was given to her by a guy named Lawrence P. Grayson, who was the UNESCO liaison. And so that's sort of some of the background on Project Best and her involvement in it. She found that file, and she leaked it to Human Events, which was old publication. I think started in like the 1940s. Still exists in an online format now. She leaked this initiative, and that summarily got her removed from the department. And so from there on, she later would write The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which is Project Best is a core piece of that, but it's much broader than that as well.
Yeah, I was almost overwhelmed by just how wide reaching this whole scheme is, because it's something that I've been relatively familiar with, but I was telling Josh as I was reading it, it almost felt like pulling up floorboards and just finding all of this black mold that you suspected that was there, but never really wanted to look at. And like you mentioned UNESCO, you like all of these sort of usual suspects show up and all this stuff, like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, Bilderbergs, Skull and Bones. And there's that quote, I hear it thrown around a lot. I don't know if it's been validated as like an actual quote, but people say that John Rockefeller said, "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." And that seems to be like the thesis statement of what they're trying to do through all of this educational subversion.
Yeah, there's a quote in my book. It's from Frederick T. Gates, and he was trustee. He basically ran the operations of most of the Rockefeller philanthropies early on. So that would have been the first one was the General Education Board, which was focused entirely on education, but then also the Rockefeller Foundation as well. Mm-hmm. And in I believe it's paper number, I can't remember the number, but it was for the General Education Board, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, "We don't need more artists or philosophers or lawyers. What we need is to help the workers perfect what they are already doing." And this is during sort of the rise of the Industrial Revolution at the time. And so basically what that meant was, moving from sort of the manual labor economy to this industrial, mass manufactured, factory based type of economy. But it's pretty explicitly, yes, that is sort of the mission statement of the General Education Board, which was one of his first philanthropies.
And you had this great, later on in the book, you have this great quote from C.S. Lewis where he says, "If education is beaten by training, civilization dies." And that's just such a pithy way to put it.
That was one of Charlotte's favorite quotes. She would pull that quote out a lot. And, it's sort of, it provides a window into the ways in which they are sort of inverting what education is or should be, and
Mhm.
that is it had that training has to do with performance-based outcomes, right? It doesn't have to do with the cultivation of the inner life of the mind, right? So training, I can train you to do something, and I could train you to do it efficiently and effectively to produce the outcome. But I could also do so in a way where you don't really understand why or how you're doing it, right? And so beyond the step-by-step instructions I'm giving you to produce the widget A in the factory, right? I could train you in such a way where you wouldn't be able to do something almost identical, certainly very similar, unless I gave you another set of instructions, right? And so the sort of the a priori principles involved in a given skill would not be cultivated within the life of the mind. But this also provides us a window into the psychological conditioning methodology or pedagogy that's basically ubiquitous in education, and that is that the ability to perform a skill is basically more or less a neurological reflex, right? It's not a conscious creative decision to follow your curiosities or to problem solve on your own. So in other words, if creating the appropriate workforce is nothing more than creating an environment in which all of the external stimuli prompt the physiology to pull the lever, push the button, then it basically suggests that the life of the mind, as B.F. Skinner himself said, and it's just more or less ephemeral, right? So he's got a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, right? And so because for him, right, all of psychology, right, all of the life of the mind is basically he's a behaviorist, right? Because it's only neurological reflexes. So that would mean that, right, things like freedom and dignity and consciousness itself is basically to use Yuval Noah Harari's analogy, it's basically like the roar an engine makes when a plane is going through the sky, right? The roar of the engine does not keep the plane suspended. It doesn't propel it forward, right? It's just this byproduct, right? This off-gassing, phenomena that doesn't actually have anything to do with the flying of the plane. So for the human being, then, right, the thoughts, the inner dialogue that you have in your mind, right, those are just secondary phenomena, the roaring of the engine that is secondary to, right, the neurological responses. So in that quote, I think is, I don't know if it's from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, but it's certainly, if it's not, it would fit nicely into it, right? Because in his idea in the Abolition of Man is that as much as he looks a lot at sort of the engineering of the human being, both biologically and psychologically, so like your eugenics and your behaviorism, but he also looks at sort of this subjectivist sort of ethos that is sort of laid on top of it, in which he uses an example from a textbook, and he just calls it the Green Book. And he suggests that there's a passage in there where somebody's commenting on Coleridge's statement about the sublime, and something about if you see a waterfall and it's sublime, and the commenters in the textbook say something like, well, what he's saying is that's the feeling that he has when he sees this thing. And the nature of this is, sort of a macrocosm of the human being, as I just discussed, right? That in nature, right, for Coleridge, the sublime, which would be this sort of transcendent or this metaphysical reality that is objective and true, that is, right, ingrained in the nature of the universe itself. No, that's all just, right, it's all just a subjective feeling that you have, right, about this thing. So it's sort of both of those things together puts us in the place where we're at today, where you have AI operating conditioning algorithms, basically programming student behaviors, while the life of their mind is sort of conditioned within this subjectivist kind of identity politics critical theory basis, in which the way you identify with yourself doesn't have to necessarily have any objective correlation to the external world, right, or the sublime or anything beyond, right, the stimulus response between the computer and then however you want to manage your own subjective feelings about your own subjective identity.
Right. Yeah. And these elites just see the unwashed masses as I think biocomputers pretty much, and that just need to be programmed to serve the system. So they're building this two-tiered structure, programming the masses. We have no need for critical thinking or philosophizing or anything like that. Like you mentioned, Yuval Harari, but I've seen clips from both him and B.F. Skinner where they both have the same sentiment of there's no such thing as free will. There's just like you were saying, stimulus and response.
Humans are now hackable animals. The whole idea that humans have, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will, that's over.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes, well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on, have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually, I think you need to attribute nothing to it.
And I guess that's the basis for operant conditioning and all of those things you were talking about. And I don't think people are really aware of how this worldview is molding the education system. I wasn't, even though I'm sort of aware of these people and what they're trying to do in the world, I didn't know until I read your book how embedded in schooling this already is and where they're trying to lead it. That was one of the most mind-blowing things I got from this.
Yeah, I went to a charter school in high school and had no idea. And as I got to all this part, I was like, dude, I don't know anything. I've just been brainwashed.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Go ahead. I think I just cut you off. Go ahead.
I think where I was going to take it is because you also mentioned UNESCO, and Julian Huxley was the head of that for a while, and the whole Brave New World society is essentially what we're headed towards if these people get their way. And I guess I just wanted to underline that. Maybe you can react to that.
Yes. So in order to sort of create the global workforce for the planned economy, you necessarily just have to, as you noted, treat human beings as basically biological androids, right? Basically biological computers that you can program, right? And this entails the hardware and the software. So the hardware being the actual physiology, the genetics, etc., the brain chemistry, the nervous system, and then the software being sort of more of in the behavior sense, I guess it would just be the nervous system, or at least the electrical signals, right, that are sent. And so you have sort of the physiological part of sort of the eugenics, right? And then the psychological conditioning is the behaviorism. So in Brave New World, if you've read it any time recently, right, you'll see that, and I've taught it for well over a decade, right? So when I teach my English 102 course, I use this. It's a research methods course, but I use this kind of as an entertaining way to introduce. Not well back then. I guess it would have been sci-fi themes, but they're not sci-fi. They're just science themes now, right? And so it gives them a little history. I'm like, we can go back to see where did these ideas start. You had this like really bizarre dystopian expression of this world that we're getting closer and closer to. And then so we use that as a launch pad for them to pick topics to write about, whether it be, right, advancements in designer babies, or, using the methods of operating conditioning through media, and, these a lot of fun topics. But so we read most of the novel. We kind of skip the middle chapters where most of the kind of the plot focuses on Bernard and Lenin, but we focus mainly on the first 5 chapters, which is like what I always call like the world building. Like, so you're getting the sense of the setting and the plot, right? But if you look at the first few chapters, right, the first one's all about the biological engineering, right? It's Volkanovsky's process, which is basically this, babies in test tubes, right? It's essentially this eugenics program that, and then in the second chapter, right, after the babies are hatched, then they go to the neo-Pavlovian conditioning centers, right? And it's basically this giant little Albert experiment on a mass scale, right? So John B. Watson, he came up with this idea that he's the one that really coined the term behaviorism. So he took it from Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt had his ideas about classical conditioning, which was the stimulus response method, which we kind of laid out already. I don't want to digress, but the Order of Skull and Bones was instrumental in taking that theory and bringing it over to the United States and then spreading it throughout the university system. But that method, Pavlov is sort of a contemporary of Wundt, right? And so he kind of brings it into the Eastern Europe. Wundt keeps it in Western Europe. Then you go down the generation or so, and you get to John B. Watson. Actually, John B. Watson, he was a student of John Dewey. John Dewey was a student of G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was the first guy, American, to get a PhD under Wundt. And he also set up the first department of psychology in the United States. So you can see that's sort of that. And Daniel Coit Gilman, treasurer of the Order of Skull and Bones, was instrumental in putting G. Stanley Hall in charge of his first position at Johns Hopkins. And so go down, right? You go through G. Stanley Hall down to Dewey, to John B. Watson. John B. Watson came up with this little Albert experiment where they wanted to see if they could condition this little boy to be scared of rabbits. So every time they would bring a rabbit out, and first he was, he liked the rabbit, and then they would bang a hammer, right? Loud noises and things like that to scare the child, so that the child would associate the rabbit stimulus with the fear of the loud bang, so that every time they saw the rabbit, they would be scared of it. And eventually you could get anything that was white and furry, he would be scared of. And like, even if you just put a rabbit mask on, he would be scared of it. And I'm pretty sure they never deconditioned the child. So that's pretty horrific. Even if they did decondition him, it'd be pretty horrific. But the fact that they would do that, and then I'm not sure what happened to that little boy, but that's what they do in the neo-Pavlovian conditioning centers in Brave New World. They bring these babies out and they put books and flowers. And the books, right, so they're scared of reading. And the flowers are so they're scared of nature. And that might have something to do with this idea about the sublime, right, and having a connection to, right, the transcendent, right, force of the universe, or right, God. And so the babies would come out, and not only would they go boom, they'd like these loud explosive noises, but they would electrocute them on these I think the floor was electrified,
Yeah.
right? So that's, so that's kind of, a fictional representation of the two tracks that basically lead us to transhumanism, right? Because in transhumanism, so traditionally people have thought of, right, nature versus nurture, right? Biology, is it biology or is it psychology? Or is it your DNA or is it your environmental stimuli? What is it that makes you, right? Now, I think largely it was always framed as nature versus nurture because during the era of specialization, in the sense that, if you have a complex project, right, you don't try to play with every variable at the same time, right? You break it down into the basic categories and you work on each domain separately. Once you have those domains, fully understood and comprehended, now you can synthesize, right? Now you can become interdisciplinary and you can figure out how to tie the two domains together. I believe that was always the trajectory, especially if you read Huxley's nonfiction stuff. The books on basically the middle shelf, all these different these are all his nonfiction works here. And he was explicitly pro-eugenics. And was very favorable to pretty much everything in the novel, including the population control and the behavioral conditioning, right? But with transhumanism, you kind of have a synthesis of these two fields in the sense that, right, through neurotech, you can basically condition the psychology directly through the biology, right? So instead of having to condition the psychology through external stimuli, like through a screen or through bells or what other learning stimuli, punishments and rewards, gold stars and detentions, right? You could quite literally, through a neural link or something like that, sort of reprogram the way the electrical signals run through the brain and through the body to elicit the body to have the response that you want, right? And so that's sort of the end game for the whole ed tech agenda, which brings us back to this notion of, right, I often use the phrase, it's sort of a medicalization of learning, right? Because if you can take learning in the mind and you can reduce it to the physiology of the brain and the electrical signals of the psychology through the nervous system, then it's not really a matter of how you can cultivate, right, your own introspection, your own ability to have metacognitive awareness of your inner monologue, to be able to follow your own curiosities and creativities, right? It's basically just a matter of how can we medically intervene into the sort of the biological computer circuitry of the body, right? And so at that point, you really don't have a notion of whether it's ethical or not to do so, right? Because that would come from some sort of like, protest, right? Would come from that place in the mind that is basically just ephemeral, right? So if we can condition your mind through a neural link or through wearables or whatever to, in a way that you will perform the economic duties and thereby stabilize the global economy, right? You really have no ethical recourse, right? Because, right, if the thing in you that says, no, I don't like that, well, that's just because we didn't condition you right yet. Once we do, right, you'll fit into the cog, and then, we'll have, what they call in Brave New World, they say social stability, right?
Yeah, it's that was a really great way to put where it's all headed, that end game of transhumanism. And the end of your book is so disturbingly mind-blowing with all that stuff. But I think you wrote this book, or it came out in 2017, right?
2019. I started
2019.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you bring up Betsy DeVos and NeuroCore and all that biofeedback stuff. That's sort of, obviously it's going to serve bringing us toward that. But as I was reading that, I looked up NeuroCore, and
it doesn't exist anymore, or you can't find it, can you?
Well, I found a few, like,
oh, you did?
I found they have a YouTube channel, and it has these little like 30-second advertisements, but it's all this really vague language, and I couldn't really even figure out exactly what what they were trying to describe in it. They use all these buzzwords and stuff, but I wonder if you could talk about what NeuroCore was going for with like that biofeedback stuff, because I think it kind of brings it into the real world to know that this is what people were trying to establish so recently.
Okay. Yeah, I was just real curious, real quick. How old were those videos? Because the reason I'm asking is because I've gone back. So on my website, if you go to schoolworldorder.info, there's a resources section, and then on the resources section, there's a bibliography section. And I took basically all the end notes in my book. There was 100 pages of end notes. It's well over 1,000. Some of them like there's a chapter in there where one of the end notes is 50 citations because it's one note for where I went through every single relevant Gates Foundation grant. So there's 1,000 numbered footnotes, but some of them have multiple. I think it could be closer to 1,500, maybe 2,000. It's 100 pages. So, and I put that up on my website. So anybody that's reading it, right, if you're like, man, I want to see that, you can go. And if it's online, right, there's a hyperlink to it. Well, the ones for the NeuroCore website, I don't know if they renamed it but those links don't work.
Oh, interesting.
I've tried to find, I've searched NeuroCore, and I had a really hard time. So that's why I was curious if those videos are newer or if they're just holdovers from before. It's not a big deal, but
oh no, yeah, I just pulled it up. I wonder if can I share my screen with you on this? Does this work? It's the NeuroCore Centers on YouTube. It looks like they're 5 years old, the videos.
Our brains are remarkable. They're flexible, dynamic, and with training can become stronger. That's why NeuroCore is so important for the middle schooler who can't focus, the grown-up who always feels overwhelmed, or grandma who wants to remember precious moments. Each center offers science-based, drug-free programs that strengthen people's brains and help them do their best. Now that's brain power.
And we're back.
Yeah, so like I was saying, I was looking at those NeuroCore videos, and it just kind of vaguely mentions that they have some kind of treatment for like ADHD, neurodivergent sort of learning, but it didn't really go into any detail. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and they have they also have like one that's called NeuroCore Pro, and so it's like it can be for athletes or just for like business people, right, to help you manage your cognitive metrics in those contexts. But basically the way it works is so NeuroCore is an EEG wearable, right? So it's like a headband, and it measures your electroencephalogram, right? So EEG, in other words, your brain waves, right, is the simple way to put it.
Yeah.
And it can infer affective states, right, emotional states, based on the different wavelengths that it picks up. And there's another company that's called BrainCo that still exists. Like I said, NeuroCore, if it does exist, it's rebranded and repackaged itself in a way that it's difficult for me to find. But the BrainCo was developed by Harvard academics in partnership with a Chinese state-owned electronics company. Similar thing. If you look up, if you type in to YouTube, BrainCo China WSJ for Wall Street Journal, you'll get it's like a 15-20 minute video.
I think I saw that where they show the classroom and the kids are wearing those headbands that like it reads their attention levels and all of that stuff. Yeah, that was nuts.
Yeah. And so in that context, largely what it's looking at is like, are the students paying attention? Are they frustrated? Are they confused? Are they are they enjoying it? Right? Things like that. So it can kind of give you a window into what's going on internally beyond are they completing the modules, right, and performing the lessons in the way that are intended. For NeuroCore, a lot of the early prototypes were pitched for, as you noted, students with various learning disabilities. So ADHD would be one. And if I believe one of the ways that they would train the student to overcome some of the ADHD distraction would basically, they have them play a game with the wearable on, and or they will watch a video, and anytime the brainwave picks up a lag in attention, either the video will stop or the game will have a particular prompt, and it's supposed to provide this intrusive stimulus, for lack of a better term, to sort of disrupt, right? So if your attention kind of goes all over the place, every time it goes off track, it's gives some prompt to, oh, I have to focus back on this video or this game. And the theory is that if you do that, over various repetitions, that somehow that would entrain the student's brain to have less ADHD distraction.
And they're doing something like that for Amazon employees, right? They have or are they?
Oh,
or is that
are you talking about bossware?
I think so. Where it's like if they put something on the wrong shelf, they get like a little not a shock, but like a little discomfort from their device or something, and then it also monitors how long they're using the bathroom and all of that kind of intrusive stuff.
Yeah. So the correct. And I don't know. So they had the technology, they had the prototype. I believe they piloted it in certain Amazon warehouses. I'm not sure if they've continued the program. I know that there was actually a discontinuation of the brain co-pilot in China. But that's so what they're basically, I mean, they're not electrical shocks, but what I understand, the buzzing is it's not exactly comfortable, right? I mean, it's kind of jarring, like, whoops, it's supposed to kind of shake you out of your distraction. But the bossware that I referred to is similar, but this is being deployed by several other companies. Oh, I should note real quick that this is something I discovered not too recently. I mean, I've been talking about BrainCo for a long time. One of the founders of that company, his name is Bi-Cheng Han, and he is a member of the World Economic Forum. So you have basically,
of course,
for sponsorship for this device. But the bossware is just like a broader array of similar wearables. Some of them are they're making as ear pods now. So
the WEF, they had it's that same thing they had in that presentation where it reads your brain waves and it gives like the boss the readout of what's happening with your attention span. Man,
right, and especially being promoted for like remote workers, right? So if you're at home, you're supposed to be on the clock for 8 hours. They want to know that you're not on Facebook or whatever, right? So maybe you're really fast at getting, project A done, and you do it quickly, and you got some time to goof off, and you're going to go on your social media or do whatever. You got to have this thing in, and it's going to tell them like, yeah, no, this guy is on the clock, and he's not actually, typing on the keyboard. And then they've got other stuff to sort of supplement that. So, right, you'll have the wearables in, but then, they can put software on your computer where it's typing keystrokes per second. And then, where are your eyes, how much attention you have on which part of the screen. So basically micromanaging all of your various biometrics and psychometrics in accordance with whether or not you're fulfilling the workforce outcomes that they desire.
And this technology has been around for quite a while, right? Because I remember being at Burning Man like 10 years ago, and I think people from Harvard were there, and they had headset in like one of the tents that you could put on and try to control a bunch of lights by changing your brain state.
Was it called Heart Sync?
It might have been. I don't remember. I think it was like 2014 or 2013, maybe.
So,
but yeah, I remember being in there, and they wanted people to come back in different states of consciousness so they could test stuff pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. So check this out. This sounds very much like so I wrote recently, it's a series on Barbara Marx Hubbard and her involvement in, the New Age and the futurist movement. And it looks at various aspects of that. But what's germane to what we're talking about right here is, so she promoted something called heart math. Okay, this is another wearable. Instead of EEGs, it's EKGs or ECGs, so your electrocardiogram. So it's not monitoring your heart rate and your heart rhythms to basically infer similar affective states, right? And so, you know, if you can combine the two, you can get the heart rate, you can get the brain waves, and then they have other things called galvanic skin response monitors, and these are supposed to somehow infer the intensity of the emotion that can be inferred through the brain waves and the heart rhythms. And heart math, it's like part of this like MLM design, right? Multi-level marketing company. And they even have like a global coherence initiative where everybody puts the wearables on, and you do a global group meditation. And while you're on that, there's like this 3D globe, and it's got little points of light where everybody is using their device in connection with this whatever is the meditation for that day or that week. And all sorts of people on the board, or a bunch of new agers and futurists, like Greg Braden is on there. I think Jean Houston is on there as well. If she's not, she's on several other boards and that dovetail with stuff that Hubbard was involved in. And they're using the heart math. Actually, they're using it in school largely to help with test anxiety. So you take this, you put the wearable on, and they give you a breathing exercise, which, by the way, are trademarked. This is kind of funny to me, like because with the MLM design, okay, you can use the wearable, but you can also be like a coach, and you can do this for like sort of consciousness expansion, kind of new age human potential psychology stuff. But it could also be used for in the context of schools for helping with test anxiety. They're actually using it in one of the counseling centers at one of the schools where I teach. But then they have them for workforce, and this gets to what you're talking about at Burning Man. There's a guy by the name of Mikey Siegel at Esalen, right? The Esalen Institute, big new age thing, all kinds of consciousness, human potential psychology workshops. Aldous Huxley was actually involved in that in the early stages, and he's actually one of the guys that helped to coin the term the human potential psychology. And but Mikey Siegel, one of his workshops was called Hacking Consciousness, and he had this wearable that's basically just like heart math, but it's called Heart Sync. And one of the things, he's a Silicon Valley guy that hung out at like Burning Man, was into all that type of stuff. He rubbed shoulders with Elon Musk and other Silicon Valley people, and so they would do sort of these workshops that can be geared for like board meetings. So before the director of the board wants to come out and set the agenda that everybody's supposed to vote on, everybody gets around in this group and they put their heart math on, and they get into what's called heart coherence. So everybody's heart rhythms are in the same wavelength to sort of get you all in an effective state, so that you're sort of primed to kind of go with the group, right? Instead of just old school like peer pressure tactics and like the Delphi technique, which is this method of building artificial consensus within group dynamics in order to basically make the people that that are in the lower tiers of the organization feel like that they are participating in the decision-making process. But oftentimes, if it's done well, it can be designed in a way where they feel like they came up with the ideas, right? The way that they'll have little breakout sessions and
wow, almost a hive mind kind of thing.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It just sounds like almost like a hive mind kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, right? Like it's another layer of helping prime conformity for whatever are the decisions of the business. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was Mikey Siegel, right? Because that Hacking Consciousness workshop was 2016, 2017, something like that. So, it's not too far from there. He might have went out there and just done some of the early prototypes out there.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So you mentioned school choice, And that's, in your book, you talk about that as sort of a Trojan horse that is helping to sneak all of this kind of, the implementation of this kind of technology and things into, and to circumvent state and federal laws, basically, and implement globalist education techniques. And that's where the public-private partnership comes in. And it's so nuts that's because I've always heard school choice, and they definitely package that in a way where it appeals to the American sense of like liberty and good parenting. Like, I want my kids to have this choice, but there's this caveat to that where they're actually just introducing this globalist technotronic overhaul.
Yeah. So right, so the end game, the end goal is to have one system of education, really one system of everything, right? So when I got into the realm of looking at how all the data was going to be aggregated for a social credit database, at a certain point you realize that it's essentially the merger of education with healthcare, the workforce training, and even policing, right? So what they call community oriented policing. So it's like, right, like I sort of was looking at education, and as I started to see things like, okay, well, wait a minute, like if you're data mining students like emotional algorithms, you're basically inferring things about their mental health or their mental status. Well, that's FERPA laws and the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment are supposed to protect students from being have their privacy about their emotional states, their mental health states, their politics, their religion. That's not supposed to be something that is data mining, tracked, or otherwise traced. So when I was looking at it, I'm like, well, this is gonna take a while because they're gonna have to recobble the laws in ways where, right, these are not violent. We're HIPAA and FERPA. Right, FERPA is Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, and then HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and something Act, right? And so one governs healthcare privacy, one governs education privacy, but a lot of this technology is, right, it sort of overlaps both. And so through the implementation of this technology, right, the data mining is going to be used to not just track and trace students into the workforce, but right, it's going to do that based on mental health algorithms that you could use to infer, is this student like at risk to become a criminal or a delinquent and things like that. So in other words, you have to have all these institutions managed by big tech corporations, right? And so the way to do that, so that requires a process of removing the local authority of the school board, right? And removing that, and then basically funneling the institutions into a corporate government, federal government, big tech partnership, right? And at that point, basically, what you have is the big tech company running the schools, not just at the local or state level, but like regionally, and also globally. So one of the ways that the charter schools kind of got that ball moving is to begin with, charter schools don't have elected boards, right? They have corporate boards. Okay, so they're appointed, and it's basically, at best you're going to vote with your dollars. If you don't like it, go somewhere else, go to a different charter school, is sort of the idea, right? That's the choice that you have. And then along with that, though, was the rise of the virtual charter schools. This is the beginning of online schools. And the first virtual charter school was designed by, it's called K-12 Inc. It still exists. It's one of the biggest in the United States, might be one of the biggest in the world. It was designed by Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett. Okay, Bill Bennett was the guy that followed T.H. Bell. So when Charlotte was in the Department of Education, the Secretary of Education was T.H. Bell. He's the one that was in charge of Project Best. He leaves in 84, 85-ish, something like that. Bill Bennett takes over. And by this time, Project Best became something called Project Slate, if I remember correctly. And he sort of carried on that legacy there. So what you have is, right, you have a virtual charter school designed by a federal government employee. And basically what this did was set the precedent for these online platforms where you can implement the adaptive learning courseware and have basically the computer machinery needed to track, trace, and log all of the data. And so those are some of the basic ways in which the charter schooling industry removes the local autonomy of the school board. It merges it with public-private and federal government big tech partnership that implements all this track and trace data mining technology. And a lot of these big tech companies that run a lot of the softwares are part of something called the UNESCO Global Education Initiative. So during lockdowns, they came up with this consortium of these big tech companies in partnership with UNESCO to help facilitate what's called distance learning. That just right now that means online learning. Back in the day, it could be correspondence learning, right? So they would send you like a package of materials, books, worksheets, etc. Then you'd mail it back and forth, and you'd get your feedback like that. And by the way, nobody ever really thought very highly of correspondence education, right? It was always kind of like doesn't really work so good because you got to wait however long to get your feedback. Who knows if the ideas are still fresh by then? And the professor gives you some feedback, and then if you don't understand the feedback and you have questions on it, right, you're sitting around waiting for a long time. So with the distance ed tech, it's like, oh, we can get automated feedback, right? You can email the professor anytime. And now we're integrating chatbots into some of the LMSs, so it means learning management systems, like Brightspace Leap has one. Most of them use an operate conditioning algorithm through a software known as adaptive learning software. So it's the same thing that B.F. Skinner came up with in his teaching machines. So he had these analog teaching machines that he came up with in the, let's say, late 50s, early 60s. There's a book that he wrote called The Technology of Teaching, and it's a whole treatise on his theory of program instruction, but it also showcases some of the early prototypes. So first they would be like analog, and you'd have like stimulus response would be the learning stimulus would be question, answer, multiple choice, matching, etc. And you put it on this disc, kind of like the old Viewmasters. I don't know if y'all are you might be okay. You remember?
Yeah, I remember those.
Yeah. So, yeah, these Disney things, you'd have like the different
slideshow.
Yeah, and you flip it and it would turn. That's kind of how the mechanism works. They had like the question answers on that disc. You put it in there. It's got two slots, one where you scribe the answer and then you turn it again. And then in the other slot's going to give the automated feedback, the right answer. Okay. And then even some of them were programmed to distribute or to dispense like chocolate if you got a correct answer. So that's the positive reinforcement, the reward part. Mm-hmm. And so you just take that, you take the analog part, you just make it digital. Maybe you gamify it a little bit with like some videos or some video games, just multimedia, make it more interactive. And basically it's going to personalize the learning in a way where if the student's really good, really effective, really fast, right, it'll accelerate the student to like more advanced stuff. Student doesn't do so good, takes too much time, they're going to remediate, and the student repeats. And this algorithm is going to continually personalize your trajectory through the curriculum in that way, but it'll also have a permanent dashboard, right? So let's say, you're like I was when you're in school and you're like, you're bored, aren't that invested, right? So they give you some multiple choice and you're like, I just want this done, especially like the state standardized tests when they used to give those, because I knew that it didn't affect my grade, right? So like at a certain point, I was just like spelling words, bad, dad, cab, right? You're just filling it in. And let's say you did that for, a couple of years because you just didn't take it seriously. And let's say one day like me, you're like, oh, well, I probably should start, taking my future seriously, right? Maybe I should pay a little more attention and give it some effort. And let's say now that I give it effort. So, when let's just say when I was in high school, I was the former. And then when I went to college, I was the latter. When I went to college, nobody cared how I did in high school. They're just looking at, doing good, keep it moving. But in this system, you'll have this dashboard. So the day that you decide to take it seriously and you're doing everything more or less perfectly, it's going to look back and go, well, you did really good that time, John. But algorithm says here, I mean, you've been messing up nonstop for several years. This is a fluke, right? Like we're not going to treat this like this is where you're at now. We're going to treat this like it's a fluke. And so you're going to have to, right? You're going to have to beat the old profile, right? In ways where, quite literally a permanent record is going to basically follow you, throughout your education and all the way into your workforce over time. But so the charter schools, the public-private partnerships, all the school choice stuff, basically was the model in which you could get the ed tech's foot in the door. Right. And so right now, there was a big move. So during most of the the Biden administration, was a lot of promotion of what's called community schools. And I touched on it a little bit in my book. I wrote some stuff after the fact on it. Because I realized it was an aspect that I didn't cover entirely. So it's a similar model in that it entails certain public-private partnerships through what are called wraparound services. And the wraparound services, again, are going to be those other institutions. So like healthcare, mental health, internships with in-demand industries in the local area for the workforce, community-oriented policing to basically take a look at if the students are at risk of becoming juveniles or other criminal delinquents. And they'll have sort of intervention programs for each of these built into the public school model. And one of the components for to receive funding from the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the federal education law that basically is the main legislation that oversees schooling in the United States, that in order to receive that funding, not only do you have to have those wraparound services, or what they sometimes refer to as pipeline services, but there's a data tracking component. So you have to keep metrics on, right, how the students are performing in terms of the outcomes, and then in all those areas, right, just academics, workforce, healthcare, and the community, the criminal justice component. But so currently the school choice thing is coming back up. It's starting to get a lot of push because we're in an election year, and the woke stuff has gotten out of control to the extent that and the parents have been able to see it online now that a lot of the students were at home during lockdowns. So it's sort of there's an incentive for people to get out of the traditional public schools and the community schools and to move into these charter schools. And they think that it's going to be you're getting out of what they call pejoratively the government schools, except that you have to remember that they are subsidized by government money, whether state tax dollars or federal tax dollars. Anything that the government funds, the government runs, right? So what it effectively is going to be is the destruction of private education. It'll be the destruction of choice, because I anticipate that the early phases will be more flexible. There will be more room to wiggle. You might not have so much woke stuff in it. But over time, and this happened in France, where they first piloted public funding of private education. This is actually happened in Vichy, France. All right. So like Nazi-occupied Vichy, France was the first place where they came up with this idea. And then it was decades later that a particular socialist leader came in. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But basically said, well, this is a travesty. You can't be funding private institutions with public dollars. So they said, well, if you've been taking government money, you are now a government school, right? And some of those were actually religious schools. They were church schools, right? So like I said, I imagine early on, in order to sort of incentivize people to build that other end of the dialectic, right? So you have sort of a community school, charter school dialectic. That it'll be open, kind of like how the internet was, early on, like Wild West, right? Remember when like YouTube first came out and anybody could do anything and anybody could monetize? And then after people were so dependent on the system where their entire livelihoods were built upon it, where commerce is, right, totally integrated with it, now they can start bringing the walls in, right? Like now you start having you can't say this, you can't say that, you're demonetized, you're shadow banned, you're deplatformed, right? And so something similar will happen. It's not just theoretical, there's historical precedent for that occurring. And once that occurs, then basically you'll just have one system, right? Whether you can call it a community, and by the way, they have community charter schools. Those will all be more or less semantic insofar as, right, the federal dollars are going to come with strings attached where you have to implement social emotional learning and all these other things that people are trying to get away from leaving the public schools as community schools. And one more note about that is of import is that, so I was at there was a lecture series at Hillsdale College, and they have a charter school program, right? And I talked to the guy that ran it at first, because I was just curious. I wanted to know a little bit about how it operates. And at one point during his speech, what he said was that we can't operate charter schools in certain districts in certain states because in order for us to be chartered, we have to do things like social emotional learning that, right, our curriculum is not about. So, and he said, and he also said that there may come a day when some of the schools that we have, we can't do them anymore because, right. So this guy who's at Hillsdale that's in charge of the charter school program explicitly acknowledged that, right. In some states, it's already strings attached, and in other states where they're not attached, he anticipated that there will come a day. So that's how the school choice model is sort of a ploy to bring in corporations to put all this ed tech in under, right, the facilitation of the federal government. And this whole model, we could use it perhaps a more simplified term. It's the stakeholder capital model is stakeholder capital modelism. The stakeholder capitalism model, right, for in the realm of education. Right?
Wow.
Sorry, I should probably shorten my answers.
No, that was great. I'm a slow boy today, if you hadn't noticed. So, and my mind is racing with all of this stuff. It's crazy. And one thing you mentioned, social emotional learning. Would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah. So social emotional learning. There's a collaborative for social emotional learning, and they have various what they call SEL competencies. Right. So there's this whole pedagogy called competency-based education. It's an extension of something called outcomes-based education. So we talked a little bit about outcomes-based education when we talk about making education serve the purposes of the planned economy. So the outcomes are ultimately economic and political outcomes, and the students need to help facilitate those outcomes by performing their the subsidiary outcomes that meet the needs of the broader planned economic outcomes, right? So the way to get the students to achieve the outcomes, they need certain competencies, right? And so some of them you would think workforce competencies would be like job specific, but I've done a lot of research on looking at some of the initiatives for workforce competencies, and funny enough, more often than not, the emphasis is actually on the social emotional competencies, right? So they're not competencies that would be like skill based for that particular industry. They're like, I'm trying to think of some of these. Some of these are going to be paraphrased. They're not going to be verbatim, but it's like self-awareness, relationship building, resilience, and things like this. And these are these emotional states that are supposed to somehow in the context of the workforce training to help facilitate the workforce outcomes, but more broadly, it's sort of to create the appropriate culture, for lack of a better term, amongst not just the student body, but amongst the labor force as well. And so sort of ingrained in these competencies is a lot of the critical theory and otherwise what they call performance identity, or it's basically what they call queer theory or trans type of ideology or ethos mixed in with the critical race ethos. Okay. And so it's basically to prime you to adopt these notions of interpersonal relationships that are supposed to basically make you conform to the global, to use a term we came up with earlier, the global hive mind, for lack of a better term, right? And so one of the things that this is where the wearables come in, because most of the wearables would fall under the social emotional, right? Because we're inferring the feeling. Okay, so let's go back to the student that isn't really like invested in it, knows they have to, got to go to school, got to get good enough grades so mom and dad aren't mad, right? And so you might go there and the curriculum's telling you some woke stuff and you don't really believe it or agree with it, but you know that, right, to get an A on the test, these are the things they want you to say, right? And let's say I'm just going to say this and get my grade. Well, if you have the wearable on, we'll know that you're lying, right? We'll know that when you're putting that answer in, you're like, I don't like this. It'll be able to infer that, right? So it's this, in Brave New World, not Brave New World, the other famous dystopia, 1984, right? It wasn't enough that you just say you love Big Brother, like you had to actually love him, right? And there's the part where he's O'Brien is torturing Winston at the end in the Ministry of Love, and he's holding up, I forget how many fingers, but he wants him to say it's the opposite. He's either got 4 and he wants to say it's 2 or vice versa. And he's saying it's 2. And he's like, no, Winston, you can't just say it. You have to believe it, right? You have to actually feel it. And so this would be, and in 1984 as well, right? They'd said things like you had to always be smiling really big, and you had to smile convincingly because it could somehow, right, the TV screens, it could see when they would do the 5 minutes hate or whatever it is. They'd have these propaganda rallies where they get everybody all worked up, and you had to participate, and there's people scanning you and the camera scanning you, and if they notice that, right, your affective state that they could infer through your facial expression and body language didn't match what you were saying, right, they'd give you they'd unperson you, right? So this is,
and even in that book, Winston was able to find a corner of his room to hide from Big Brother, but it sounds like in this world you would not be able to do that at all.
Well, yeah, I mean that's so basically once they get the social credit kind of infrastructure in place, and right, whether you have to have your digital ID on a handheld device, or whether it's through wearables or whatever, there won't be any public or commercial service or even privacy in your own home where you won't be able to think or do something without some device picking up some sort of biometric or psychometric that's going to go into your social credit score. I mean, that's the idea. And for B.F. Skinner, this would be utopia because, right, for him, the way to make a utopia has nothing to do with the cultivation of the soul or the spirit or the morality or, right, the mind in any way. It's just if you build society with the appropriate external stimuli, then people will just like robots, right? They can only do what the environment conditions them to do. So in other words, there's no evil, there's no immoral, there's no wrong, right? Those are just the effects of poor conditioning, right? So for someone like him, that would be, it's like a Skinner box, like a global Skinner box. So his ideas about and he called his teaching machines his Skinner box. And the theories, so you see all these experiments where they put rats in mazes, and he's got a pigeon pushing a button, and when I was a kid, you'd look at it and like, why? You know what I mean? Like, okay, so we got the mouse to go through the maze. What are we learning from this? Like, because you're thinking that, you're learning something about the mouse, but you're not, right? You're inferring something about animal behavior that can be applied to the human and to the group more broadly. So those experiments that he had, this is why they were called operant conditioning, was because most of them had to do with, like a pigeon, but they'd have to perform something. You'd have to push a button to get the pellet. They'd have to prove an operation in order to get the reinforcement, right? And so I went blank. Sorry, my brain just Like I told you, I got that little bit of brain fog from
No, I've
from
got it too.
grappling again. Oh, that's it. So right, so he took that theory in the psychometrics that he inferred from the animal training, applied it to his teaching machines that he called the Skinner box, and then if you just take that concept and now just expand it out to the broader sphere of public and commercial life, now you have basically the planet enclosed in a Skinner box.
This whole thing sounds like a dismal Black Mirror episode.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I usually so I've been teaching, when we do the Brave New World lesson, and we get towards the end and we start to look at some of the transhumanism, we look at social credit. And I show them that video on it's a Journeyman TV documentary where the guy's in China and he follows a few people around. One guy has a high score, one has a low score, and there's people in the middle. But I always point them to there's a Black Mirror episode called Nosedive that is
Is that the wedding one?
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
And they all have the lady has to get her score up to be able to attend it.
Yeah.
And part of it's, she lives with her brother and her brother's score isn't that high. And therefore, because she lives with them, doesn't matter that they, have totally separate ideas and lifestyles. It's the fact that they share a room brings her score down. And so the whole thing is, you see somebody, and every time you see somebody you cross somebody on the street or in an elevator, you can score each other up or down based on how that interaction went. So everybody's just like Winston, trying really hard to be polite even when they don't mean it, and in a really stiff way. But yeah, a lot of that stuff, a lot of these I guess you call it predictive programming in Black Mirror. It's as far as sci-fi shows go these days, dystopic stuff. If you like watching it, it's worth it. The first season was, I think, the best one. The most recent one, I wasn't super excited about. But
do you think that the social credit score is going to get tied in with some kind of crypto and blockchains?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the end game. So definitely the idea of having a blockchain ledger is something that is not just being promoted for digital ID through roundtables like the World Economic Forum, but I've seen other programs where they'd be tied to digital badges. Okay, so as you do these different modules online, you earn your competency, you'll get a digital badge that'll be on your blockchain ledger, right? And this will certify you to do whatever job, or maybe to go this route or that route through maybe a university or some workforce internship. But definitely some form of a distributed ledger technology, right? Where basically they can track all of your interactions through the ed tech devices, and then it'll be merged with both your workforce data and your healthcare data, it'll be on a blockchain. Now, would it be tied to some sort of a token based system? I mean, I think that is ultimately the end game, because that's ultimately what sort of helps to incentivize the metrics, right? Or in other words, the scoring. So if you could program somebody's money, right, as opposed to just being able to track who, what, where, and when, a lot of the CBDC proposals entailed within that is so the tokens would be you have to spend them after a certain amount of time, or you can only spend them on certain things. I wrote about this in one of my Unlimited Hangout articles. There was a proposal for moving to a blockchain crypto version for either Snap or Wick, or these are they're one of them's food stamps. I think Snap is food stacks. Wick, I think, has to do with stuff for single mothers, right? And so what the General Assembly had proposed, and I don't know how long they've gone forward with this. I'm not aware that it's been implemented yet, but it's got infographics on it. I screenshotted one of the sort of how the whole app infrastructure works. But basically, okay, if you're on SNAP, right, and you're on food stamps, well, they're going to program the tokens so that you can only use them for like healthy foods, right? And you have to, so in other words, you could program these tokens so that they can only be used for certain things. And therefore, if your social credit score goes down to a certain point, right, either things could just be your tokens wouldn't go as far, or you just wouldn't be able to use them at all. And so in general, right, the way that finance and money is sort of, to use sort of it's the currency, but sort of as a double entendre, right? Like it's literally like a current, like an energy current that, right, sort of directs the traffic of human behaviors into the outcomes you want, right? And so the social credit score, all that data determines where the money goes, and then the money determines what you do, right? And so it kind of, right, sort of, to use their energy analogy. I should have mentioned too that, so the Castle, Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, was set up by a guy by the name of Jim Fetzer, and Jim Fetzer was a huge devotee of Alice Bailey, right?
Oh,
so,
yeah, the Occult.
Yes, right. And so ingrained in social emotional learning, there's an excellent James Lindsay. I met him. We both spoke at the AFA, American Freedom Alliance, a couple of years ago. We spoke on a panel together. He's done a lot on social emotional learning and looking at sort of not just the communist roots, the communist socialist roots, but going back to the Hegelian roots. And then from Hegel, right? Here's a book. This is all my new age stuff down here. Rather than bother with the, here we go. So Hegel and the Hermetic tradition. This is an academic tome here. It's Cornell University Press, right? This isn't like conspiracy literature. But he basically traced, and I honestly I've always kind of inferred that, right? So if you just think of the duality implicit in in Hegel's dialectic, and there's other, and sort of the alchemical idea of, right, the union of opposites, yeah, right, transmuted into this new thing, right? His whole idea of I always was like, man, it's really close to like Gnostic stuff, and
dissolve and coagulate.
Yeah. And apparently it quite literally is. So so James Lindsay does a lot of work on that, and one of the things it's called, the title of the video is WTF is SEL. Nice. And he reads through portions of Education New Age by Alice Bailey. It's this book here, and traces sort of the buzzwords and sort of the rhetoric that's used for social emotional learning comes almost, verbatim out of certain sections of this book. So there is an explicit, or maybe I shouldn't say explicit, but if you understand, you trace the etymology of these terms back to, right, education in the New Age and stuff, there is very much a sort of an occult, Gnostic, Hermeticist dimension to this idea of the whole social emotional learning program.
Yeah, and that seems to track because she's involved with the Lucis Trust, and they're involved with the UN.
Yeah.
And Alice Bailey, is she the one that wrote The Externalization of the Hierarchy?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
That's her, yes.
And that has kind of like a mission statement in there of like getting rid of Christianity from the public sector, or however you want to term it. It's been a while since I read that, but yeah, all of that stuff seems to track with the things that she was trying to do through the thesis.
Yeah, and then sorry, go ahead.
No. I was trailing off. Go for it.
Oh, that's okay. And then another connection, because you mentioned the Lucis Trust, right? Lucis Trust is a contractor at the United Nations. Well, there was it's over there somewhere. I don't know where it is on by memory, so I'm not gonna go over and dig around for it. But Robert Mueller's World Core curriculum, not Robert Mueller, the investigator that was on the whole Russiagate Trump thing. It's a different Robert Mueller who was high up at the UN. My memory serves me. You can check this on. You can check the felicity of this on my unlimited hangout series on Barbara Marx Hubbard. I believe he was under Kurt Waldheim when he was Secretary General, and Kurt Waldheim was a Nazi, right? He was a Nazi before he became Secretary General of the UN. But he came up with a World Core curriculum, and this sort of is sort of a precursor to what becomes Common Core over here. But he was another devotee of Alice Bailey and the whole New Age thing. One of the things that really I want to do a follow when I'm done with the Hubbard series. I want to zoom in on this book and tie it into SEL in some ways that James Lindsay's video touches on, but doesn't. I want to go a little deeper because a lot of the phrases, like she uses a phrase in here, at one mint, like atonement, but with hyphens. And I've seen that in Hubbard's stuff. Now, Hubbard does not, and all the stuff I've read, you look at the bottom shelf there, I'd say about a third of it is Barbara Marx Hubbard stuff. So from the corner all the way over to the Alvin Toffler books are Hubbard's works. And I've not come across where she's, explicitly talks about Bailey or who's the woman before her, Blavatsky or
Annie Besant,
right? But then there's phrases in there that come directly out of it, right? And so I wanted to do a piece where I kind of synthesized a lot of that, because also in here has something to do. They talk about like how the educators in the New Age will be more like psychologists than pedagogues, and that the students would be prepared to fulfill different roles that parallel these different the root races that are the theosophical root races, right? Like the
Blavatsky.
And I forget the other one. Is that Lemurian, Atlantean,
and Mu,
Aryan, right? And this is where Hitler, right? Why he liked her stuff, because his whole Aryan theory. So so how would you do that? Well, you'd have to get data on the different root races. So this is your eugenics. And the way you do that is through the psychometrics, through the heart math wearables that Barbara Marx Hubbard promotes that are integrated into the social emotional learning, right? So, I mean, it's clearly a New Age project. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I think you had a chapter about where you mentioned Yuval Harari talking about these things as basically exactly that, like churches, and I think they'll replace religion with this new data philosophy, or I can't. I'm sorry, my brain is
data is
scrambled, but yeah, dataism. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy that they're explicit about that. That this is a replacement for all of our traditional mysticism. Like that's bunk now, and this is the new way.
Yeah, and it ties into the whole transhuman thing. So we can go back to the whole. I mean, there's a whole array of different Gnostic flavors, right? Your Valentinian, your Sethian, et cetera, right? But what is very common among most, if at least many, if not most of them, is this inverted garden story from Genesis, right? Where the serpent, who is Lucifer, right, is the hero, and Jehovah or God is, right, the villain, right? And he kept Adam and Eve in this prison, but it was Lucifer that through the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but oftentimes the Gnostics like to just focus on the knowledge part, right? They were able to break out of that prison, and right, as the serpent says, he goes to Eve and says, hey, eat this fruit. She goes, well, no, because God says we'll die. And they say, well, no. He knows you'll become like him, meaning you'll become your own gods, right? And this is 100%, right? That's the nature of books like this.
Homo Deus,
yeah. So, right? God man or man God, right? And you have people like Ray Kurzweil who say that The more we interface with our technologies, the more we will become godlike.
Yeah, he wrote Age of the Spiritual Machines, right?
Yeah. So there's 3 of them right there. There's Age of Intelligent Machines, Age of Spiritual Machines, Singularity is Near. By the way, he was on Joe Rogan yesterday or the day before.
Oh.
I listened to the whole thing. You got to listen to it. And he's got a new book coming out. It's the Singularity is Nearer, or When the Singularity is Nearer. So he's gonna have some updates on that. So I'll have to get that book. But there's several other allusions to sort of the idea that when we merge with machines, that we will become godlike, right? They had at one point the way of, it's called WTOF, right? I think it's one of those like Discordian kind of double entendres. They like to do like potty language jokes in their symbolism. So I think it's supposed to be like WTF, way of the future. You just get rid of the O. Church of Artificial Intelligence, where it's defunct now, but they were like wanting to create a church where you would worship some kind of AI avatar or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have like Ben Gertzel's robot. He calls it Sophia, which could just be wisdom, but right, in the sense of the Greek etymology, right? It was also a deity, right? And it's a deity it's part of a lot of Gnostic cosmology, right? So it's interesting that so this idea that dataism, right, like that you are your data more than you are anything, right, physical or biological or even right electrical in terms of right what's going through the machine, right? And if you think of data, right, data, whether it's computer code or whether it's statistical quantities or whether it's qualitative data like language, right, what they all have in common is they are symbols that are, if not metaphysical, right, are certainly not physical, and are basically bridges into the metaphysical, right? So in other words, right, like I am not the language, I am not the words, right, but I can't really identify with myself without the words, right? And so it's kind of this thing where, as opposed to we use the data to infer something about our objective metaphysical nature, whether it is the nature of humanity or the nature of the universe and reality. Basically, what they want to do is just cut it off as a bridge and make the data itself the metaphysic, right? Mm-hmm. But if you do that, then basically, we're back to where I was suggesting earlier, which is that if your algorithms, they put together a social credit score and they say, hey, John, we inferred that, your biometrics or whatever suggest that, you're going to do something we don't like in the future. And I could sit there and tell you all day, like, no, that's not me. That's not what I'm going to do. Like, the data says that you are the data, right? Like, so it would, the more we integrate with these machines, and by the way, right now, one of the things they talked about a lot in that interview, and I've been seeing this pop up a lot in a lot of alt media spaces, like this is going to be like we can use AI against AI. There's going to be this as these chatbots get better and better. One of the things they were talking about was they can use you can translate you into stuff. So right today, when we're done with this, there's software out there. You can run it through AI and it'll take the video and it'll have us speaking in whatever language you want, but it won't just be overdubbed. Like, it'll change our mouths so it looks like it, right? So in other words, you can create like an avatar that could handle all your emails and all your text messages. Like, this could be like your little work bot thing. Okay. And at a certain point, right, let's just imagine a future, perhaps not too far from now, where most of the time you interact with somebody, you're interacting with this avatar, and you may or may not know the difference if it's done well, right? at a certain point, I could see a time when, especially in a generation or two, when people have grown up in a world where that's all that is, the sense of the intuitive sense of whether or not you're talking to the human, him or herself, or the data, right? Because that's all the avatar is, right? It's not you, it's an image of you. It looks like you, it sounds like you, it talks about, it's just data, right? It's data converted into image and sound. That you would not only would you not care whether it was the avatar or the person, but you wouldn't have a notion of how or why to distinguish that in any way to begin with, right? I mean, so it's this world in which basically you are the data, right? There is no longer any metaphysical essence to your soul, right? Like you're only as good as the metrics surrounding you.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I heard about a program that, I don't know if it ever came to fruition, but they were talking about it years back, of like somehow resurrecting your dead loved ones with the data from their online activity, so they could turn them into like a chatbot, or even recreate their voice, and you could talk to them like through your Alexa or whatever, and that would be just as good as talking to like their ghost, but it's just the data and it's not actually them. But that's one of the crazy contradictory things that this worldview seems to get all twisted. Like what they don't even, what is it? the materialism and the lack of metaphysical reality, it just starts to blur lines to the point of absurdity, and everything gets so abstracted, and you just lose touch with what's real. But then you stop believing that there is really any objectivity anyway, except what you make in the world.
Well, I mean, and you know what? I've been seeing a lot more discussion about simulation theory as this occurs. So what do so now imagine that simulation theory is out there and being entertained more and more seriously at the same time that we're interacting more and more with avatars, right? I mean, all of us here, grew up in a world prior to all this, but imagine, right, a generation that grew up hearing nothing but simulation theory and interacting with avatars. I mean, I can imagine a time when, in the future, when if we were able to, go to the future from the past and tried to explain stuff about how that's, reality is objective and there's a difference between it would just be like you'd be speaking a different language.
Like, or you'd just be bigoted. Like, it's like, no, the AIs, they have human rights too. Like, you can't call them fake. They're not real. How dare you say that?
Yeah, that's another one. Right? I think, honestly, a big part of the politicization of the whole trans movement is a step in that direction, to the extent that, right, if there's no biological basis to your identity, right, then there's no physiological basis to your identity, right? So if you can identify as whatever you want, then why can't you identify with your avatar? What makes your avatar less you than the physical you, right? I mean, this is sort of like this. There's this in my introduction to most of like performance identity theory, which is queer theory, and just the postmodern stuff more broadly, has, because my background is in language, right? So it's language arts. Literature is actually the base. Is my degree is officially in literature, but I had a grad assistantship, so I was trained in rhetoric to teach rhetoric. So that's what I've always taught. I teach a literature class once in a while, but mainly I teach rhetoric. But there's a theory called deconstructionism. The guy's named Jacques Derrida. Okay, and the idea is he refers to old notions like the historical grammatical approach to language and philology and etymology in the objective sense, as he calls it, logocentric. Right, like logocentric, but this is like a pejorative for him. And he says, no. So modern semiotics, starting with Saussure, so you have these three terms. You have the signifier, the signified, and the referent. So the signifier is the symbol, like the text or the data. The signified is the concept that it refers to. So this would be like the, like the metaphysical, the abstract, transcendent, maybe like to use a Platonic term, like the form that it actually refers to. And then the referent is the thing itself in physical space, right? So if I said human, human, I'm right, I can refer to you or me or the whole thing, right? The word human is right, that's the signifier. The signified is this concept that we all have in common, right? And then the referent would either be me or you, right? Derrida says there basically is no referent. There is no objective, right? It's basically just, so it's just text. He calls it text-centric. It's just symbols referring to other symbols, text referring to other text. So since there's no, so just remove text, because he's largely talking about languages, and just change it from a qualitative verbal text to a quantitative digital or computational text. In other words, data, right? And so at that point, once we've already divorced ourselves from our bodies through these postmodern ways of identifying a man as a woman and vice versa, you're only one step. You're one step closer to why would I can be in the metaverse and I could be a man one day, I could be a woman another day, I could be something in between a third day, I could be Frosty the Snowman another day, right? What makes any of that any more real than me? Because in performance identity, in queer theory, their whole thing is that everything you do is a performance. None of it has anything to do with anything about the essence of your soul, of your own personal identity, your own consciousness, none of that, right? You perform different roles in different parts of society. So you perform one role at work, you perform another role with your friends, you perform another one with your family, okay? And so everything is just a performance. So then, right, as commerce and even social life is mediated more and more through the screens, and then eventually the metaverse, right? You're basically, right, we're moving in a direction, right, under the, while this umbrella theory about simulation theory is kind of being thrust upon us, we're moving in a direction, whether we're aware of it or not, where increasingly, right, we're being more and more divorced from objective reality, the physical nature of who we are, and moving more and more into identifying with and as data, right? And once you do that, right, who controls the data, right? Who's the one that puts all that together? You don't do it, right? At the end of this, I don't know, maybe you will, but I don't think you're going to go back and go into the source code and figure out, come up with some metrics from whatever Zoom track between us, and then you're going to use that that's going to determine how we interact the next time we see each other, right? The only people doing that are the big tech companies that are doing the data mining for the purposes of engineering this global workforce, right? And to transmute the human creature into the transhuman or post-human creature. And if you think about the sort of a metaverse realm, there's a way in which the Gnostic notion of this physical world, right, the physical body being a prison, well, you can get out of that now. You can get out of it with your wearables and your VR headsets and your implantables, and you can go and you can literally be your own god, create your own universe in this, right? You can have a little space in the metaverse. I want to hang out in the jungle today. I want to be in the desert tomorrow. I want to be an animal one day. I want to be a cartoon character another day, right? And this would essentially be, right, you would be limitless in a way that some might suggest is godlike. And I don't think that, by the way, I don't think that maybe Yuval Noah Harari and some of his friends might profit from more of the purported liberatory aspects of that, but I don't think the average person would even be allowed that much freedom in the metaverse, right? You're pretty much just going to be performing some VR workforce task, or if you're not capable of, right, cognitively capable of even the most basic workforce functions, well, we could just put you in front of advertisements and video games and come up with and data mine various metrics just to sort of, right, get a better sense of how the brain and the body work for better conditioning for other more useful widgets.
It's so much to take in. It's like it's a hard thing for me to even wrap my head around this way of seeing the world. As exposed to these ideas as I have been, it's still always like it's bewildering. And it's like, yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I know you said earlier that my publisher said the same thing. It was kind of, he didn't use the phrase black pilling, but yeah, it's definitely not something that's fun to think about quite all the time. But
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess the way I think about it is that a lot of this is coming from people who have this God complex, and I think a lot of it really is just delusions of grandeur. Like I don't know how I mean, obviously I believe in God and that he's ultimately going to have the last say in all of this, and so I like to think that most of this is just kind of blowing smoke, or from people who, I mean, obviously they wield a certain amount of power in the world, but I just I guess we'll see how it plays out, but I can't imagine that they'll actually get what they want. I sort of see them as like an Indiana Jones villain, where when they finally like attain this transcendence, it'll just destroy them, and they wouldn't have seen it coming because they were so blinded by their pride and hubris.
Yeah, they'll think
Yeah.
they'll be able to upload their consciousness, and a copy of your consciousness isn't your consciousness, so they'll just obliterate themselves.
Exactly, right, and I'm that's pretty much where I was going to go with that. So I don't know. I've thought about it a lot. I don't know if they really believe their own hype. I wonder if that is the narrative to incentivize us to want it and to participate it and to willfully give yourself over to it, right? This idea that you will be a god and you get to live forever and make copies of yourself. And Kurzweil thinks that, or this is what he says. He says at one point, way down there, like, you won't have to just be in the metaverse. You could create through a swarm of nanobots. Once you've uploaded your consciousness into, right, the global computer system, that instead of just manifesting whatever body you want in metaverse space, you could manifest whatever body you want through a nanobot swarm. So like each nanobot would like be a pixel on a screen, and they could take the shape of whatever you want, and they could have the colors of whatever you want. So you could be Puff the Magic Dragon or whatever. You could program this thing to take the form of whatever you want in physical space. Not, I don't know how much they believe in that, but this is something that he says. But to your point, I would imagine, and we would never know, right? So if somebody supposedly uploaded their consciousness, right, and they're in the computer or they're in a nano swarm or whatever, and you're talking to it, and let's say it's my grandpa or somebody, and you're like, yeah, this is me, and I could talk and I could ask him questions, and he'd answer it in the same tone of voice, the same body language, the same mannerisms, the same types of answers, right? Everything that would make that grandpa would do. If you asked it if it was conscious, it would tell you. But you would never know if it was just programmed to say that, or if it actually had a layer of self-awareness where it actually thought of itself as conscious, right? So I think of it kind of like as, it would be like a really, really complex GIF, like right, a GIF, right? Where those pictures that they'll do, some simple motion and they'll repeat the motion. right? So so you could have a gift that does this, then you can have a gift that does this, and then you can have a gift that does both of them. And just keep adding, right, responses to whatever stimulus you feed it verbally or otherwise. And if you data mine enough interactions from that person over time, that the algorithm could come up with something that would be very convincing, but you would never know if it was actually conscious. The only way you would know is if you uploaded yourself into it, right? It's like one of these things where, it's like pain metrics. The only metric we have for pain is to ask the person, how bad is this hurt? When you go to the doctor's office and it's got a scale from 1 to 10, it's got the sad face and the happy face, right? And the reason is because, so could you measure like inflammation, like, quantitatively through a wearable or something? You could, but that doesn't mean that person is experiencing the same pain as somebody else. I have knots in my hands from getting that gummy all the time, and I used to have a guy do acupressure on it, and he'd be pushing, and I'd be like he's like, you got a really, really high pain tolerance. Like most people won't let me, push that hard on it. I was like, I want you to get it out, and it would hurt. But like I said, most people wouldn't let me do it. So in other words, it's the same amount of pain, but I don't experience it the same way. Like if you put a wearable on it, right, where one person goes 10 is way before my 10. Right. So it's just one of these metrics that you can't actually quantify without the participator, right, giving you their personal statement. So it'd be the same thing. Are you conscious? You could measure, there's electrical activity going on in there, but there's electrical activity going on inside of a gift too, right? That layer of self-awareness wouldn't be something you could quantify, right? But as you noted, right, there's another term that is used sometimes in a slightly different manner than transhumanism, but sometimes pretty much synonymously, and that's post-humanism, right? There's only one other way that we use the root of that term, which is posthumous, right? Posthumous, right? Meaning dead, right? So if you think of, there's the sort of the cliche thought experiment about you got a boat, right? And you take this boat and you replace a panel on it, and you replace another panel, right? And still the same boat.
Oh, it's the ship of Theseus.
Okay, cool. And so at a certain point, right, it's like it looks the same, but it's all new pieces, right? Is it the same boat anymore, right? Yeah. And so it's same thing with sort of this so it's like, okay, I'm a human, but by the way, I have metal in me. I guess I'm kind of transhuman a little bit. I don't have computers in me. But you know what I'm saying? This is just like pacemakers. These are some of the arguments that that people make, like Ray Kurzweil. Oh, well, you wouldn't say that you shouldn't have a pacemaker. You wouldn't say that you shouldn't have a rod in your arm.
Yeah, we all carry cell phones. I've heard this thing.
Right. So then it's like, right. I don't think I'm a cyborg now, but how many more things do you have to add until you're more machine than human? And then if you keep going, at what point is there nothing human left, right? So the more you expand your consciousness, the more you integrate with these systems, you're not really in it. I mean, the way I see it is you're not really integrating it. You're replacing and replacing and replacing. So where when you get to that singularity point where you upload your consciousness or you merge with AI or whatever it is, as you know, right? Have you just basically just posthumously annihilated yourself, right? Are you like, right? Have you really evolved into some new transcendent creature, or is it basically quite literally a nihilistic project to basically, destroy the human consciousness itself under the guise of, right, some kind of apotheosis?
Yeah, that thought experiment about the boat. If I remember right, I think it's from one of Plato's dialogues, and it's been so long since I read it, but for some reason, I have it in my mind that one of the things he's trying to get at with that is there must be some kind of metaphysical principle that makes me what I am. And it's kind of ironic that would kind of get flipped to where it's like there is no metaphysical principle beside the data and the material that makes what it is. But yeah, if I remember right, it was like Socrates saying like, well, you see me here as this human being. I have flesh. I have this snub nose. if you took all that away, like what am I? And I don't remember it that well, but I think he was kind of getting at that there's like this, like I said, a metaphysical principle, some kind of soul or spiritual thing that brings all those things together and makes him an individual being. And I wish I could elaborate on that more, but that's just kind of what's coming to mind at the moment.
I mean, and that kind of alludes to where I went with the conclusion. So, I mentioned my publisher was like, I just was going to end it at the last one on the post-human AI stuff. And like, he's like, this book is very scary. You cannot destroy people's in life and humanity and then just end the book. And I was like, so you need solutions based. He's like, yeah, something like that. And I was like, okay. So it's probably the densest chapter. A lot of it I was sort of learning or as I went through it, sort of based on some things that I've always kind of intuitively inferred based on my own spiritual journey about the nature of the metaphysical, right? I mean, and so at a certain level, it's not necessarily the technology itself, right? I mean, we're here, right, using this technology to, hopefully spread some awareness that might steer our usage of the devices in a more appropriate direction, or perhaps maybe I don't know that this is even going to be a possibility at this point, but to put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak, somehow, right? Maybe just like ways to opt out. But so it made me, I had to think about, ultimately, I think that, the crux of where these things go has everything to do with our notion of metaphysical truth and right, the absolute truth of reality and nature and the mind and consciousness. And, so there's like two, I sort of laid them out already, right? There's kind of two threads that drive this system. You would think they are antithetical, but they actually do go together. And so one is basically a material determinism, and the other one is a postmodern relativism, right? And so if you think of empirical, determinism, material determinism, right? I mean, that, right? Empirical, it's what we observe, what we measure, right? This is objective, right? It's not relativistic or subjective, right? In terms of, in the ways that sort of like the identity politics stuff is, right? But even things in terms of like what is observable and what is measurable, it never gets you to the, as Kant said, the thing in itself. It never gets you to the essence, right? You can measure it more and more and more, right? So it's like, what is the precise measurement from my chest to my desk? Let's say it's 6 inches. Well, more accurate measurement would be, in centimeters. And more accurate than that would be millimeters, and more accurate than that would be, and you can keep going until you get in like Zeno's paradox, where it's like, right? I mean, is there an infinite amount of space between me and the desk? Well, clearly not, right? I mean, otherwise, this thing's still here. So, something similar in the same vein, if you think of just like subatomic particles, right? I mean, the smaller you measure, the more paradoxical their behavior gets, right? Where it almost appears that things are right in two places at the same time, and things like that, right? So empirical measurement never gets you to the objectivity, right? There has to be, as Kant said, something that the thing in itself, you have to start with some a priori presuppositions about the nature of something before you can even measure it at all to begin with, right? I mean, this is how data sets work, right? Like, if you don't have some a priori categories in which to sort the individual data points, you just have random data points, right? Like you can't actually aggregate or synthesize or extract any of the patterns of the data unless you have some sort of a priori category to fit them, right? And so embedded in this notion is that you kind of alluded to it, is if you don't presume some kind of metaphysical nature and you just keep measuring and measuring and measuring, and you keep going down that direction, you will end up in a scenario in which the human creature becomes as what it means to be human is as paradoxical as the Zeno's paradox or the subatomic particles, right? I mean, like, it's just the nature of it, right? Like, we got these psychometrics and biometrics and we can infer X. Oh, but we can infer even further if we add the galvanic skin response monitor. And then you can keep going and going until it's like, what's the difference between you and your data? Right. And at that point, you're, whether willfully, knowingly or not, you are on the trajectory to essentially annihilate what it means to be a human creature. Right. And so, you know, and something similar goes along with the whole postmodern aspect. I mean, that's a little more easy to grasp, because it's just the idea that you can identify with something that's totally in contradiction to what is observable empirically. Right.
Yeah, one thing I was
jump in.
One thing I was thinking about when you brought up Jacques Derrida is I saw a meme where it shows a photo of him and it says, "Believes words don't have inherent meaning, writes book about it." And
yeah, and another funny one is, so part of deconstructionism is that because everything is just a text and there's no objective reality or metaphysics, everything is basically just every rationalization of an ideology is nothing more than a subjective justification for will and power. And so it's like, well, you know what that applies best to? Your theory, right? I can do that with him, right? I can apply deconstructionism to his theory in that way, because he literally admits he has no objectivity and there's no metaphysical truth or reality. So he explicitly embedded in it is it's just will and power, right? And it's just, you know, we just flip over the power structure, and it doesn't matter if the inverse is objectively better or objectively true. It just matters that we get to run it, right? You know, and now if you try to do that with something else like, you know, Christianity or pretty much any ancient philosophy or religion, you're going to come up to a point where you have to have the discussion about metaphysics, and now you're in a totally different conversation where that doesn't quite work the same way, right? But the way that the sort of the postmodern relativist identity politics goes with the determinist stuff, as I mentioned, is that, right, once you keep measuring and measuring and measuring, and you get to this paradox where you can't tell the difference between you and your data, well, the best way to facilitate, or the only way to have any sort of a priori categories to sort things in is through the notion that you can come up with your own a priori categories, right? So we still need them, right? We still need them, but we don't have to worry about whether they're correct or right or true or objective, right? Just pick the category of identity that, for whatever reason today, suits your affective state, and then we'll try to get the metrics to facilitate that as best as possible, insofar as it is streamlined with, right, the turning the continual wheels of the global economy. So ultimately, right, these two things that you think are opposite, right, they ultimately go together. So in the conclusion section, I tried to I was hoping at the time that there were this is before lockdowns. I was hoping there might have been a time to perhaps you know, reform the public institutions. I don't know how much of a chance we have at that. I'm not giving up on it, but I'm just saying that, you know, for the time being, it's going to be wise to get out as quickly as possible, going to a homeschool, not a virtual charter school. But also, as we continue, you know, as we have this conversation about where we're going, you know, as a species, we have to have a serious conversation about metaphysics, right? So just the nature. I mean, and even for people that, right, are not religious and don't have any notion of the spiritual or the metaphysical, at least start from the understanding that cognitively, right, you can't make sense, whether empirically or subjectively, of any data points or any phenomena unless you start, right, cognitively, psychologically, with those presuppositions, right? Like you have to admit, like someone like Matt Dillahunty will say, like, yeah, you're right, but I don't care whether the presuppositions are right or wrong. I just accept that we got to have some. Well, hopefully, if we can talk about that not as, you know, some woo-woo phenomena that is, you know, sort of secondary to the everyday social, political, economic relationships, that we can admit that, well, it's good that you know that in order to understand the internal mind and the external world, that there is an a priori mode of cognition that sort of loads all the data points. If we can at least admit that, then we should also be able to admit and be aware that every presupposition isn't the same, and at the very least, some are better than others. If not, some are objective and others are not, right? And so that hopefully, you know, that we need to start that conversation. It's a long conversation because it's one that hasn't even been touched on for, you know, in academia, the notion of, forget metaphysics, just ontology itself. It's not even a school of philosophy anymore. It's just all linguistic analysis, which is, you know, it's all that post-Derridian, you know, notion of, right? It's just text and data everywhere.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on 2 hours. Would you still be down to come back for part 2 where we can go over that epilogue and maybe have a debriefing of all the crazy stuff we talked about today?
Yeah, and that would be cool. And you know, I'm an Orthodox catechumen now, and so maybe we could talk a little bit. And some of my what got me there has to do with everything I just talked about, right? You sort of heard me talk about the nature of a priori presuppositions. I said I didn't know anything about tag and stuff like that when I was doing it, and then I stumbled across a Presbyterian guy where I learned about that in John 1:1 the word is actually the logos, and then that sort of led me to more orthodox apologists and tag arguments. I'm like, oh, this is what I'm talking about, right? And you know, and then you get into the history of the church, and you see like how a lot of the stuff, these Gnostic, Hermetic, New Age tropes are actually like old heresies that go back to, right, the founding of the church, that were basically, you know, weeded out through the various councils. And so none of this is really in the book, but you know, since this is an Orthodox podcast, maybe we can talk about that along with anything else you guys want to talk about.
I would love that.
That would be great.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for your time coming on today. And yeah, this has been great. It's a lot to chew on. So I hope I wasn't too bewildered as the host. But
I hope I wasn't too verbose as the egghead. So
yeah. Yeah, it's been good. Yeah, I really look forward to another discussion. And I guess we'll end it there.
Well, yeah, you want to plug any of your stuff?
Oh yeah, plug your stuff. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, no. So schoolworldorder.info is the website. It's got, you know, you can get the book through there. It's got all my social media, video stuff. There's a bibliography of sources. There's a database that's got a bunch of the files that Charlotte gave me. Yeah, that's the quickest way. Like if you go to the website, you can find my Twitter and all that other stuff. Yeah, that's the quickest way.
Right on, man. Thanks so much for your time, and we will talk to you again soon.
Right on.
Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, man. God bless.
Humans are now hackable animals. You know, the whole idea that humans have, you know, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will, that's over.
I've had enough of this dude. He's kind of right out of the frame. Well, okay.